Hello and welcome to the SilverStripe screencast. In this tutorial, we're going to add some Ajax behavior to our site. So we'll just go over what we'll cover here. First, we'll start by writing some JavaScript to get started, and that will be a pretty quick overview because we're not too focused on writing JavaScript in these tutorials, so get that out of the way. And then we will move on to an overview of something called ViewableData, which is a core class in SilverStripe, very important. And then we will render a partial template. And lastly, we'll polish up with some UX enhancements for the Ajax behavior. So in the last tutorial, we added some pagination to our list of search results. Now we're going to enhance the user experience a bit by adding Ajax pagination to the links. So before we do anything, we need to create that JavaScript that will add this functionality. We will do all of this in our catch-all JavaScript file scripts.js. This is in your theme directory /js. So I just check if we have the pagination div, and then I'll assign a click event. And I'm going to filter it out on the main div because that's the area that's going to be refreshing. So this is all pretty much boilerplate jQuery stuff. We're just going to replace the main content with the HTML, and then we'll just do a simple failure case. And for the purposes of graceful degradation and search engines and all that, we want to use the href attribute as the URL. So this is pretty specific to this use case, but further down the track, we may find that we're adding a lot of Ajax events that closely resemble this. And in that case, we may want to make this more reusable at some point. But for now, let's just get it working. So let's give it a try. We'll click on any link in the pagination and see if it works. Well, it kind of works, right? We've still got a ways to go. The controller is returning the entire page from the opening HTML tag to the closing HTML tag in our main div. So that's not good. We've injected the whole page in the middle of the page. So we need to revise that. We are using the href attribute as the Ajax endpoint. So anything different than that would be unusual, right? So what do? We could change the URL in our JavaScript to use something other than href. We could use an alternative URL, something like data Ajax URL. That's actually not necessary. We always aim to keep things tidy with single endpoints. So the controller ideally would know as little about the UI as possible. And setting up a separate endpoint for Ajax request in this case would be antithetical to that. We really want to keep the same endpoint and just assign the controller the ability to detect Ajax requests and react to them. So let's update the property search page to detect Ajax. So now give the link a try and see what we get. You should see a custom Ajax response. Now we just need to return some partial content. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about a key player in SilverStripe Framework called ViewableData. So to establish a basis for the next section of this lesson, it's really important that we know about how ViewableData objects work. ViewableData is a primitive class in SilverStripe that essentially allows its public properties and methods to render as content on a template. The most common occurrence of ViewableData objects is data object instances, which we've been working on all along in our templates. But templates are actually capable of rendering much more than just database content. You need to go a little bit further up the inheritance chain above data object to viewable data, or a subclass thereof, to create arbitrary variable content on your template. So let's just look at a simple example of a viewable data class. Let's just call this address, and I will assign some public properties, street, city, zip, country, all that. I will give it a method that takes the country, and we'll use a fake class here called GeoLibrary that just converts the country, the two-letter country code, into a readable, in this case it would say United States. And then we'll have a computational method that just gives you a nice readable address and splits everything up into line breaks and all that, returns some HTML. So now let's create a template to render that object. And as you can see, we can just say that I live on $street and $city, and my full address is $full address. So as you can see, we're rendering data using a combination of both methods and properties. ViewableData has a very specific way of resolving the template variables on the object. First, it's going to check if there's a public method on the object called variable name. So in this case, $country would override the country property that is set to US. If that method doesn't exist, it will go to a method called getVariableName. See if that exists. So $full address will resolve to get full address in this case. If that doesn't exist, it will check if there's a public property defined on the class called variable name. So something like $zip would work for that. Otherwise, it's going to invoke a method called getField, and it's going to pass the name of the variable you're trying to get. Now, getField is kind of a fallback method. For the base ViewableData class, it simply returns the property variable name if it exists. So a bit useless in that sense. It's just kind of there to be overridden. The idea is that subclasses can invoke their own handlers for this. So for example, in data object, getField looks at the DB array, which makes sense, right? When you try to call content against a page object, it falls back on getField content, and you end up with the content out of the DB array. So back to our template. All viewable data objects know how to render themselves on templates. To do that, you simply invoke its renderWith method, and you pass it a name of a template. The template variables will all be scoped to that object, and you will get a string of text or HTML. So here we have, I'll just say my viewable data equals address. I'll just create a new instance of our sample address viewable data object, and then I will return the result of renderWith address template. And that's how I would render that template that we just saw. So another really useful feature of viewable data is that the object itself can actually be called on a template to render itself. You don't need to just call its properties, you can actually call the object itself. If we were to simply call $myaddressObject on a template, SilverStripe would attempt to invoke a method called forTemplate on the object to render it as a string. In our example address object, that might look like this. So we would wisely want our forTemplate method to just return getFullAddress. So that's sort of the default way to render an address object. A great example of this is SilverStripe's image class. When you call $myImage on a template, it will invoke the forTemplate method on image, which returns a string of HTML representing an image tag with all the correct attributes and values. So you use that all the time in SilverStripe, that when you're just rendering an image or maybe a resampled image, it's falling back on that forTemplate method to get you the HTML. All right, so that's a really brief overview of viewable data. Hopefully you understand it a bit more. It is a really important class in SilverStripe. Many things that you're dealing with all the time in SilverStripe are descendants of viewable data. So really core class to understand. Let's now play around with some features of viewable data. Right now we're just returning a string to the template for our Ajax response. Let's instead return a partial template. So at the center of dealing with Ajax responses is the use of includes in your layout template. So let's take everything in the main div and export that to an include called property search results. So I'll just cut out all that content. I'll create my property search results file and just dump it in there and save. And we'll reload the page with a question mark flush to get the new template. Okay, now that we have that, returning an Ajax response is fairly trivial. We'll simply render the include instead of the current text that we're returning. So let's try this out. It's not quite working right. We're getting a no results message when we paginate, and that's because the $results variable is not exposed to the template through renderWith. Think about it. It's just a local variable in our index method. When we go to the full page, at the bottom of the method here, you can see that we are returning a customized version of the template where we've injected paginated properties to a variable called results. We haven't done that in our Ajax response. So we have two choices here. First, we could assign the paginated properties variable to a public property on the controller, or we could explicitly pass it to the template using a method called customize. Of these two options, the latter is much more favorable. There are cases where the first option makes sense, but in this case, explicitly passing the list makes our property search results template more reusable. And assigning a new member property would pollute our controller unnecessarily. So let's avoid that, and we'll make the update now to just use customize. It's the same idea. I'm just going to pass paginated results to a custom variable called results. Now, looking at this, we can see that we've repeated ourselves with the data array. We have two arrays here that say results mapped to paginated results. Let's clean that up a bit. So I'll just put the data array above the conditions because we know we're going to need it either way. And then I'll say customize data. And at the end of the function for the non-Ajax response, we'll just say return data. All right, try it now, and it is looking much better. All right, let's do some UX enhancements here. It still feels a bit clunky. There are two major shortcomings in this user experience that I can see. One is that the scroll stays fixed to the bottom of the results, leaving the user with little indication that the content has been updated. Also, the URL is not updating when we paginate. So when we refresh the page after paginating, it will take the user back to the first page. That's no good. So let's clean up those things now, and we'll just make some updates to our JavaScript. So first, in our success function for the Ajax response, we will add an animate method that just scrolls to the top. And then we will push some state to the browser history using push state. And that will just contain the URL and the title of the document. And lastly, we will just export this whole Ajax call to its own function so that both the pagination links and the browser back button will be able to invoke it when we add a onPopState event, which we'll do now. Now let's go back to the site and give it a try. And we do see that the URL is updating. We're getting a nice scroll here, so this is looking good. All right, so this is an update to this lesson. After this was published, we had several users report a bug in the way the Ajax history was working. So to replicate it, let's just try paginating a few times, and then we'll click on a non-Ajax link that will take us to another page. And then once we've done that, we'll click the back button, and we only get back the Ajax content. So this is a bad thing. You may not be able to replicate this in all browsers. Google Chrome seems to reliably reproduce this bug. So why is this happening? The short answer is that good browsers like Google Chrome are really, really smart, and that's what makes them so fast. In this case, perhaps it's being a bit too smart, but ultimately this really falls on us for making a critical mistake. Earlier in the tutorial, we talked about a common endpoint for standard HTTP requests and XHRs, Ajax. So it's true that both types of these requests should be piped through the same controller action, but the idea that they should share exactly the same URL is flawed. One of the pillars of HTTP caching, and really the entire HTTP protocol, is that a URL should be considered unique. It should only point to one body of content. So when URLs return various responses based on arbitrary external state, like session state, or in our case, the type of the request, bad things can happen because the browser has cached that URL, believing that it has already seen the response that it generates. This is great for performance, but bad for the type of turnkey functionality that we're trying to implement here. So we need to update our JavaScript so that the Ajax request has a slightly different URL than the URL that's being stored in the history. So let's just append a simple Ajax equals 1 request parameter to the URL. So first we generate the Ajax URL variable, and that is whatever URL the function is given plus Ajax equals 1. And notice that we have to be careful not to add the Ajax parameter multiple times. We do this because the pagination links preserve all the get parameters from the Ajax request. So those links all contain query strings like start equals 10 and Ajax equals 1. So we don't want to keep adding Ajax equals 1 if it already has that in it. Next, we generate the clean URL variable, which is the URL with the Ajax equals 1 removed. And again, the pagination links all have Ajax equals 1 in them, so this sanitization is important. We then update the Ajax request to go to the Ajax URL instead of the given URL. And lastly, we store the clean URL in the browser history so that when the back button is pressed, the browser knows that the Ajax request and the standard request are different. Now, in order to test this, it is imperative that you clear your browser cache. This whole bug revolves around eager caching, so you won't see any results until you do so. If you're using Google Chrome, you may want to try incognito mode for this. And now when we press the back button, it is returning the expected result, and things are looking and feeling much better now. So bit of a retroactive update to this lesson. That's the first time we've had to do this. Give that a try and hopefully that resolves that bug. Alright, that's all for this tutorial. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.